The last 8 months have brimmed full of unspeakable and indescribable horror. I say that literally as a writer. The words simply are not there to describe atrocities of this magnitude. But even for those of us who have no illusions in the West's political and media elites, it is this that has shocked us to our very core. I mean this, of course, as well as the daily live streaming of horror, the mass slaughter of tens of thousands of Palestinians, the maiming of so many others, so many dead, killed, slaughtered children, the suffering, the grief of so many of their loved ones being so savagely butchered. I'm not talking about the life of a Palestinian not being treated as having equal worth to that of an Israeli or a Westerner. We're not even close to an approximation of this. It is the lack of pretense that Palestinian life has any real meaning at all. Now, the first video I made about this horror on the 9th of October had a very simple title: Palestinian Lives Matter. That's because it was clear from the beginning that the decades-long dehumanization of the Palestinian people was now going to have its most hideous expression. Let me just give you a hypothetical scenario. 4 Palestinians have been arbitrarily held by the Israeli military. Palestinian fighters stage an armed intervention and free them. In the process, they slaughter over 200 Israelis, many of them children. Huge numbers of Israeli civilians are maimed. Footage shows Israeli mothers screaming over the bodies of their slaughtered Israeli children. How would this be reported by the Western media? As a daring operation to release unjustly held Palestinians? No, let's be clear. It would be treated as a massacre, rightly, as a despicable atrocity, as indicative of the utter depravity of Hamas. So, what then of Israel's operation to free 4 Israeli hostages who were seized on the 7th of October? Now, let's be clear, as I've always been clear from the very start. Taking civilians hostage is a very serious war crime. No cause on earth justifies kidnapping or killing innocent people. Anyone with a sense of humanity should want these hostages to be returned to their loved ones. One of those freed was Noa Argamani, and the footage of her being seized, driven away on the 7th of October from her boyfriend, taken on a motorcycle, begging for her life, that haunted me for weeks afterwards. I'm sure it did for so many others. Now, the sense of relief felt by the loved ones of these 4 Israelis will simply be indescribable, not least her mother, who is dying of terminal cancer. Here are the facts. Israel has killed far more of its hostages than it has secured the release of by military means. That includes, of course, the 3 Israeli hostages who were killed by Israeli troops despite waving white flags and screaming in Hebrew, underlining that if they were going to be shot and killed by Israeli troops, then what hope for Palestinian civilians? But there's also overwhelming evidence that many other Israeli hostages have been killed by Israeli missiles, which is unsurprising given bombs with the combined explosive power of several Hiroshima bombs have been detonated in a strip of land no bigger than East London. Now, the only mass release of hostages has taken place through a ceasefire and an exchange of prisoners. In the meantime, Israel has laid waste to Gaza, slaughtering tens of thousands of civilians, including at least 15,000 kids, imposing famine amongst so many other horrors. In this operation today, the Israeli army massacred huge numbers of innocent civilians in Nuseirat camp, including children. Now, the footage I've seen is horrific beyond words. Palestinian parents wailing over the bloodied corpses of their kids, the mangled bodies of civilians covered in blankets, indescribable injuries. Now, here's how the operation reportedly took place. According to Al Jazeera, Israeli troops used a humanitarian aid truck and a civilian car to sneak into central Gaza. This in of itself is the war crime of perfidy. That is a deception where you promise to act in good faith with the intention of breaking that promise once the enemy has become vulnerable as a consequence. It will put all aid workers at risk because now all humanitarian aid trucks will be under suspicion of containing Israeli soldiers, which will at any moment massacre huge numbers of Palestinians. Now, we constantly hear accusations that Hamas use, whether it be hospitals or indeed aid trucks for military purposes. That's routinely presented as evidence for their depravity and to justify destroying civilian infrastructure. So what now are we supposed to say about the Israeli state behaving like this? This in itself will undoubtedly further slow what little aid is getting into Gaza, and that itself will kill many more Palestinians. Let's listen to this testimony from a Palestinian man who survived what we should be describing as a massacre.
مارق في الشارع اجى شحن صف كله اواعي وكله طناجر يعني تقول واحد جاي من رفح يعزل عنا ما بنسبق الا هم نازلين بيجي 10 قوه خاصه ونزلت الطخطخ خدت 3 أطلاق في صدري وفي إيدي، ونزلوا اشتباكات طخ طخ. بعدين ما أدريش عن حالي، قصف وانفجارات. في الآخر انسحبوا، خدوني الشباب وطلعوا في على العودة على المستوصف تبع السوق. ومن العيادة من غادي أخذوني على الأقصى، من الأقصى جابوني هان، وما جا خبر. طلعت برا ما لقيتش ولا مخلوق في السوق، كله مرمى مبطع على الأرض مستشهد وراسه مقطوعة.
What does this all mean in practice? It will mean far more death and destruction. There are reports that other hostages were killed in this operation, but those reports, of course, need to be confirmed. It will almost certainly mean far more hostages are killed, given Israel keeps recovering the corpses of hostages. And the longer this is dragged out, the more likely they are to be killed. And the only proven means to release significant numbers of hostages is through ceasefire and prisoner exchanges. Netanyahu will ride the wave of jubilation in Israeli society. Those demanding a ceasefire will now be marginalised. The Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz was expected to resign over a lack of strategy for Israel's military rampage. He's now cancelled his speech. The most popular demand will now be to release all the hostages by military means. The hostage deal negotiations with Hamas will surely be trashed by this. Those demanding more blood and slaughter in Israeli society now have the winds in their sails. The consequences will be huge numbers of Palestinians slaughtered, butchered by weapons, or starved to death. We've seen the immediate price paid by Palestinians, but the price to come will be incalculable. Yet many media headlines have simply erased the horror suffered by Palestinians. So, for example, in this Washington Post headline, it was, "For Israel, a rare day of joy amid bloodshed as 4 hostages rescued alive." There isn't even a pretense here that Palestinian life has any worth at all. None at all. Is it understood that the rest of the world hears this? How do you think we look to the rest of the world? And I will tell you, depraved. David Lammy, the shadow Labour Foreign Secretary, who's set to become the Foreign Secretary of the British government when Labour wins an inevitable landslide in a month's time, tweeted, "It's now 245 days since October 7th when these hostages were kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival by Hamas terrorists. Their rescue is a glimmer of hope in the darkness." Not one single mention of the horrors inflicted against the Palestinian people. I've met David Lammy many times, and I know that if you asked him, do you think Palestinian and Israeli civilians have equal and innate worth? He would undoubtedly answer, yes, of course I do. But how is it possible for him to justify such a statement based on that tweet alone? How would he justify it? Those politicians and commentators celebrating this operation should be asked, do you think that over 200 Palestinians, many of them children, being slaughtered is an acceptable price to pay for 4 Israeli hostages? Get them to say it on record. They should also be asked, do you think the war crime of perfidy, in this case, pretending to be a humanitarian aid truck, is acceptable? Get them to say that on record too. I want to say this as well. As I've said, the taking of hostages was a grave war crime. It is good to see that after hospital tests, it's been confirmed the Israeli hostages released are in good health. That doesn't detract from the horror of them being taken and kept away from their loved ones for so long, and we will undoubtedly hear their testimonies in good time. Let us not forget the thousands of Palestinians seized by the Israeli state, often without any charge, and detained under horrific conditions. These are the Palestinian hostages held by the Israeli state. Now, we've heard allegations of sexual violence presented as central evidence of the unique barbarity of Hamas. What then to make of these details in a New York Times article, which you can only find by reading to the very end? Now, these details are horrific. I must warn you of that in advance. Eunice Al-Hamlawi is a senior nurse from Al-Shifa Hospital who was arrested in November. Let me read. Mr. Al-Hamlawi, the senior nurse, said a female officer had ordered 2 soldiers to lift him up and press his rectum against the metal stick that was fixed to the ground. Mr. Al-Hamlawi said the stick penetrated his rectum for roughly 5 seconds, causing it to bleed and leaving him with unbearable pain. A leaked draft of the UNRWA report detailed an interview that gave a similar account. It cited a 41-year-old detainee who said that the interrogators made me sit on something like a hot metal stick and it felt like fire, and also said that after another detainee died after they put the electric stick up his anus. That's rape. If we heard such a report from an Israeli captive at the hands of Hamas, it would be front page news and lead news bulletins as key evidence of Hamas's depravity. But in this case, buried in a New York Times article. Again, the lack of pretense that Palestinian life matters at all. It is the most disgusting spectacle of my life. And the consequences of that will be felt, not just in this hideous present, but for many, many generations to come. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments. Do help us take on the pro-war videos over at patreon.com/ownjoseph. Listen to the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.